Welcome back. A couple of videos ago, I talked about a recent release by Third Man Records and their collaboration with Blue Note in what they are calling the 313 series. So this series is 5 albums long as far as I can tell. The first one that I got in was Electric Bird by Donald Byrd, and my comments were that it was actually a great reproduction of the original. I did a little bit of a shootout. So guess what? I was so excited or enthusiastic after that first release that I thought I better order the second release, which is Thad Jones' Detroit, New York Junction. All right, so first off, who is Thad Jones? Well, Thad Jones is a trumpet and cornet player. I would say still he's probably best remembered for his work in big bands. Early on with Count Basie, kind of had a middle period where he wasn't necessarily playing with big bands, but did some more solo stuff. And then later on, he formed the Thad Jones and Mel Lewis Orchestra, which continued maybe even to this day. I think that group still exists. So he's kind of had a variety of experiences, and within the context of certainly this album, it's him in a much smaller format. Also worth noting with Thad Jones is that he is from Detroit, and also that he has 2 famous brothers. One is Hank Jones, the piano player, and the other is Elvin Jones, the drummer, obviously the drummer for John Coltrane for some time. One thing I wanted to bring up that I think is kind of interesting, independent of this particular album we're here to discuss, is that Thad Jones put out an album for Period Records around about the same time, and this one is called The Jones Boys. Funny thing about this, and I think it led to a little bit of sort of confusion because, yes, Thad Jones does have 2 famous brothers, Hank and Elvin. However, on this one, Thad is joined by Ronald Quincy Jones, everybody knows him, Jimmy Jones, Joe Jones, not Philly Joe Jones, but Joe Jones, and Eddie Jones, and guess what? Thad is not related to any of these musicians. So this is a little bit of a concept album. I think that Leonard Feather had something to do with in terms of putting it out. It's actually pressed by Plastilite, which is kind of fun. But otherwise, no confusion. These are not his actual brothers, but he does have 2 famous ones. All right, so I do want to share a little bit of a comparison between these 2 albums. Just one other thing worth noting is just some of the credentials on this particular album. Again, Detroit, New York Junction. So as the name suggests, and one of the reasons why it was chosen by Third Man for this particular series is the prevalence of Detroit area musicians or people who are from Detroit. So obviously I told you Thad Jones is. We also have Kenny Burrell on here, also from Detroit. Tommy Flanagan as well. Billy Mitchell was not from Detroit, but he did move to Detroit at an early age. And the other 2 musicians that we have are, let's see, Oscar Pettiford, who's from Oklahoma, and Shadow Wilson, who is from New York. So at least at least there's some Detroit musicians on here. And again, one of the reasons for the choice in this series, as well as I'm sure the fact that it's actually called Detroit. Or the Detroit is actually in the name. So contrary to a lot of Blue Note sessions, this one was not recorded by Rudy Van Gelder. In fact, a lot of these early sessions actually were, provided they weren't live dates, but this one was not. It was recorded at Audio Video Studios, which was in New York, and I will say that the sound it's evident that Rudy Van Gelder didn't record it. It doesn't actually sound as good. It has a little bit of an older sound. So you kind of have to know that going in. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when I get into the sonic comparison. All right, so as I did with the Donald Byrd title, I want to do a little bit of the packaging comparison as well, just so you kind of know what you're going to get. In the Donald Byrd video, I talked about some of the variants, and I'll talk about that a little bit about that as well. I think I have a little bit better idea in terms of what those variants are than maybe even I did a few days ago. But this is how the cover looks. Similar to the Donald Byrd title, what you have is a matte background, and then everything that's black on this album is kind of a glossy laminated kind of thing. And so if you kind of move it back and forth, it sort of catches the light. And what I mentioned when I talked about the Donald Byrd title is how beautiful that cover was. But I also referenced that I felt like people would probably have more negative things to say about this one in terms of them messing with the image. And I do have to say I would agree with that, with what I thought a few times ago, that I actually do prefer the adjustments on the Donald Byrd album and not necessarily as much on this. And there's a few reasons why. I mean, there's some pros, don't get me wrong. It's very sort of dynamic and bold, kind of high contrast, right, between the very blacks here and sort of the matte finish around. It actually still is really nice cover construction. This is like thick jacket. It's kind of like the Acoustic Sounds Contemporary series that they're doing in partnership with Kraft. in terms of the jacket construction. It does feel very nice all around, but I'm just referring, I think, more to, in terms of cons, like how it kind of looks. It doesn't seem like, it just doesn't seem like it works as well. And one challenge that I have in comparison with this and an original pressing that I have right here, and I'll show you a close-up of this, is actually the detail in Thad Jones's picture. So here, the contrast is turned up. It's kind of grainy, almost looks like it could be like a photocopy. You lose a lot of the trumpet detail here as well. And then on the original, it's simply there. It's more present. And so I felt like they didn't do as good of a job replicating the photographs on the cover. Now, don't get me wrong, on Donald Byrd there was no actual photographs from them to replicate, but they just did a better job, I think, of representing what the cover was. And here, I just don't think they did as good of a job. All right, so when it comes to the vinyl, this is what my copy looks like. So if you recall the video that I made about Electric Byrd, I had what was called the Eclipse edition, which is a black vinyl, and then it had kind of a yellow sort of splatter in the middle. That was limited to the Third Man website. I didn't even realize I ordered that copy from Third Man directly, but apparently I did. So that was that edition. Third Man is also putting out a solid white, what they're calling indie exclusive, which I believe you can still get from their website, but then I think that's also the version that's going to be available in stores. So now then, let's see what else. Obviously, the black version you can get from both Third Man as well as Blue Note, bluenote.com. And then Blue Note also has this version as well, which is, I guess, their limited edition. So again, mostly blue with this sort of white splatter kind of thing. One other thing, actually a couple of other things you're going to notice here that I think are quite unfortunate. The first is that obviously you have the yellow, the adjusted Third Man, label as opposed to it being blue. What you'll also see here is that it says stereo long playing. So they made an effort to replicate a Blue Note label, but what they didn't account for was that this is a mono recording. This Third Man edition is not a stereo recording. It was never recorded in stereo. It is mono, okay? The other thing that they could have done that they didn't is that you'll see here, they says Blue Note Records, Inc., a division of Liberty Records, Inc. Well, that would be here if it was a reissue and not the original. So the original has the Lexington address, that would be listed here, and it just, to me, it feels like the easiest thing they could have done to both have this say mono, as well as actually replicate, make a little bit of an effort, I think, to replicate what the original label was. All right, so briefly, I want to talk to you about the music. There actually is a really big difference between how an original pressing sounds and how this copy sounds. So I said it before, I was very impressed with how the Electric Byrd title was sort of replicated, right, by Warren DeFevre, the engineer who is working with Third Man on these titles. Thought he did a really, really good job. There was just the differences were so minimal, it was almost nothing. With bass, the sort of emphasis of bass being one of the most prominent notes that I had on that title. So with this title, I'm sorry to say that there is a big difference, and it's not a positive one between this and an original. So, I'll say up front, and I mentioned before that Rudy Van Gelder didn't do this recording. Even the original pressing has a number of flaws. And those flaws are that the piano as well as the drums are pushed way to the back. All right, so it just has an older sound. When there are soloists, they are highlighted and brought forward, including when the piano solos. It's brought forward. The guitar is brought forward when they're soloing. Obviously, Thad Jones and Billy Mitchell as well. But generally speaking, it sounds like an older recording. Thad Jones's tone is a little bit thin, especially when they're playing melody, as opposed to the solos. And so there's no detail in the original recording really. It's kind of, like I said, it's thin sound. You know what it sounds like is that it was recorded in, like, I don't want to say a vacuum, but someplace where there's no ability for sound to bounce off of anything, and so there's a thinness to it. So when the sound is played and it makes sound, it sort of dissipates into nothing. And oftentimes with these recordings, and one of the things that Rudy Van Gelder did very well is kind of have a little bit more of the sound of the room. It actually can enhance and add some detail and kinds of things to the recording. And it felt like this one just didn't have it. So from the outset, the original is, it's an understatement to say it's not the best recording that Blue Note ever did. All right, so that being said, so we know that the original wasn't great. Why isn't this one Great. And why is it worse? Okay. So in an effort to add bass to this record, well, this is what I'll say. Okay. They added bass, but not to the bass, if that makes sense. So there is a bass versus a treble sound that is washed across the entire recording. So the bass doesn't sound, say, boomier or deeper, or certainly not more detailed. The entire recording sounds like somebody turned up the bass knob on like a stereo, and everything is like brought down and muted even more and compressed, and it's muddy, and it just doesn't sound very good. And even to the point that a variety of these instruments don't sound natural. I think the best example of that is Shadow Wilson's brushwork that just doesn't sound right. It sounds like somebody's using like wet sandpaper or something on wood. It doesn't sound like drums whatsoever. So I think it's especially problematic with his brushwork. I also think when he's hitting the toms, it doesn't sound natural. There's a number of examples where Kenny Burrell's guitar, just the tone sounds completely different, like he's using effects or something versus the original, just because of how much that bass, both the accentuation of bass and therefore the removal of treble, at least from a balance standpoint, just really impacts the sound significantly. I will say that Thad Jones and Billy Mitchell still sound okay, and there's a couple of examples where I'll say that they especially sound good. Thad Jones sounds really good on the third piece, which is a ballad, which is titled Little Girl Blue. It's actually just it's in a trio format with Kenny Burrell as well as Oscar Pettiford on bowed bass. And that track actually, even on this reissue, sounds pretty good. I still think it sounds better on the original. And then the other place that I think stands out a little bit is Billy Mitchell's tenor solo on track 2, which is Tariff. And that one sounds okay as well, but the problem is, at least on track 2, is that all the other musicians surrounding it just don't. They don't sound good, and it sounds unnatural. I don't feel like it's a good representation of what the music is, and I hesitate to say that because I didn't really like the original either, but I think the difference is that if on the original it feels like there's nothing for the sound to bounce off of, and it just kind of dissipates, on this reissue, the problem is it feels like the walls of the room are like crowding the musicians, and so everything that they play has an immediate like reverberation from the room, and like I said, it sounds very unnatural to me. So if I was going to sum this up, I would say this. On the original, Thad Jones's trumpet is more dynamic. It's more detailed. There's a better sense of of sort of the volume dynamics going up and down. There's a better sense of his vibrato, which is kind of like shaking the trumpet almost a little bit. You're supposed to use your lips to do it, but a lot of people kind of fake it by shaking their hand. And because I'm not that great of a trumpeter, that's how I would do it. I'm sure that Thad was doing it with his lips. Kenny Burrell's guitar is much more detailed as well and more dynamic. You get a better sense of some of the nuances of that instrument, and so even though the old one is thinner and there's still plenty of flaws and it's still an older sound, whatever they tried to do with this reissue, it doesn't, by comparison, it just doesn't sound good. And what I'm wondering now is if I had only ever heard the reissue, if I would have the same thing to say, that some of these instruments didn't sound natural. I'm really wondering if I'm only comparing it to the original or I'm comparing it to what these instruments should sound like. I haven't actually heard some of these criticisms in some of the other videos that other video reviews that I've listened to. A lot of people reference the fact that the bass was a little bit turned up, but they didn't reference that it was like not limited to just the bass instrument, that it was something that pervades the entire recording. And I didn't hear anything about instruments sounding unnatural. And so I don't know if that's just a problem that I have knowing the original recording and having an original pressing, or if it's something that's going to bother everybody else. All right, so where do we go from here? In the last video, I said I was nervous. I was nervous about Third Man and Warren DeFevre taking on a 1500 series Blue Note mono recording. And I was also very impressed with their treatment of Donald Byrd's Electric Bird. I truly believe that that's a great pressing. You should go and get that one. This one gosh, my concerns came to fruition, and I'm kind of bummed out. Now, one thing I will say is that this is the only title of the 5 that is one of these old recordings of 1500 series mono, and the other ones are more modern pressings. So am I still enthusiastic about some of those others? Yeah, I think I am, but it's such a shame that that they decided to take this on this recording. It really hasn't had a decent reissue by anyone else as of late, and they just didn't do it justice, I feel like. So I'm bummed, but it is what it is. You can't be not every reissue can be a an overwhelming success. So those are my thoughts. I'd really be curious what you think, especially if any of you actually went out and picked up this record. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. In the meantime, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown, and I'll see you next time.